Roy Rogers, or any of the numerous westerns, the shoot-em-ups that we had on Saturday afternoons back in those times. If times were good in my family, I got a nickel for a bag of popcorn to go along with it. I mention that because how breathtaking it is for you younger generation, and that you have to pay for a bag of popcorn at the movie. We had short subjects in addition to the cartoons and the serials that some of you may know about in those days. One of them was a thing called the March of Time. And it was a newsreel, kind of a news magazine on the screen for whatever the current events of the day were. And of course, being during World War II, there was a lot of war in those newsreels. It dealt with important events in current society. The March of Time, or the passing of time, are concepts we're all familiar with. But these concepts are totally wrong. Time does not march. Time does not pass. We pass. It's like a fast-running westbound car on an interstate. We pass mile marker after mile marker, but the mile markers don't move, do they? And we correctly speak of points in time. We pass those points in time. They don't pass us. And this is something I think that's important for us to understand. The mile markers don't move, we move. But on this interstate, there is no eastbound lane. We pass mile marker after mile marker, but we can never go back. We can't even stop. We just keep running. And this is another of the profound truths of the Bible. We are rushing headlong through life. We are here for a little while, and then we pass. Man that is born of woman, said Job, is few of days and full of trouble. He comes forth like a flower and is cut down. He flees like a shadow, and then he's gone. A long time ago, God decided to impress upon his people a lesson about time. And in the strange way to us that he goes about doing these things, he sought himself out a man who happened to be his friend. He asked him to leave his home, the house he lived in, to leave his city, and to go into another country and to live there as a stranger. And he basically, what he took with him was what could be carried of his family. And for the rest of his life, Abraham, Sarah, their kids, never lived in a permanent house. Never. In all their life. The story is told a little bit in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. And isn't that like life? By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city that has foundations, whose builder and whose maker is God. What he was looking for was a place to finally be. No longer a nomad, no longer going about from place to place. Having left a city, he was looking for one that would last, because the city he left certainly did not. Later in the same chapter, in verse 13, speaking of all these people, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them way off and were persuaded of them and embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. This place, they confessed, was not home. They were going somewhere. They didn't even know for sure where they were going, but they went in faith. He says, they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from which they came out, they just might have had opportunity to go back. But now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Think about that. They left one. They lived in tents all their lives. They had a promise, and they grew old and died never having received the promise, and yet they retained the faith to the day of their death because they knew the promise was still there. It's a striking thing when you think about the implications of all this. Now, it is so tempting to try to make a permanent home for ourselves along this highway. It is so tempting to think we can just put down roots somewhere, and then I can be somewhere, and I'll never have to move again, and I'll always be in this place. This will always be my home, and I can always come back to it. We would love to have a sense of permanence, but any such feeling is an illusion. It is not real. We are here today, and we're gone tomorrow, and there is nothing we can do to change that. And in our sober moments, we all know that. The best we can do is to pitch a tent, a tabernacle, if you will, along the highway. My dad used to sing in a Stamps quartet, and he dragged my mother and me all over this part of the country to sing in gospel singings and singing conventions and concerts. And I grew up listening to gospel music, perhaps lying on the floor in a school over in Oklahoma somewhere while my dad and his quartet performed for the group. Some of the only live entertainment they ever saw in that town was a gospel quartet. The gospel music of that era, and I hadn't thought about this so much, but the gospel music of that era had been written during the Depression. And it was very different music from the gospel music you hear today. I'm inclined to think, well, it was better then than it is now. And I don't know that I'm a fair judge, but I have come to realize one thing. The best music arises out of pain. The best music arises from a sense of loss. And it was out of that depression that some of the greatest of Southern gospel music ever arose. And when you think about it, both Southern gospel and the Negro spiritual had a very similar theme. The theme was, I am not at home here. This is not all there is. I have a better place. I have an enduring place. I look forward to something better than this. The slaves, for their reason, and the poor Okies that were out of work during the Depression for their reasons. But all of them realized that hope in this world, in this life, now was vain. And they could see it in ways that honestly, I don't think we do. We are too prosperous. We are too well off. We have too much. And consequently, we could never write a song like some of them wrote. Over time, I grew to love both gospel and spiritual music. And I had to realize that the best of the music comes from hard times. I remember a song from my youth that says, in a way, what I'm trying to say. The song went, "O Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, O Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore." That last line, the last line, I can't feel at home in this world anymore. A person who is friendless, who may be homeless, who may be out of work, living in poverty, and who says, if I can't have a home with God, I don't know what I'll do. I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Now, I learned from my daddy's music that this world was not my home. I learned that before I ever got to school. This world is not my home. There is something further out there. Now, there are some themes in the Bible that the composers of gospel music, like Albert Brumley and whoever it was who originated many of the Negro spirituals that you will hear them sing. And by the way, the proper way for a Negro spiritual to be sung is without accompaniment, sitting down. It's the way it was done. There are some themes in that. Whoever wrote them, they captured these themes from the Bible. Heaven, for example, which is kind of shorthand for the kingdom of heaven, for the city of God, for being with God. It's just a short word for the kingdom of heaven, which would be cumbersome in a song. Much easier to say heaven. Heaven was shorthand for the kingdom of God. The promised land, Canaan, was a symbol for heaven. A hymn, for example, which I think somebody suggested last night we didn't sing, on Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's happy land where my possessions lie. I am bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the promised land. This theme comes from the idea that, which is in the Bible, it's very biblical, that symbolically Canaan, the land of Canaan, the promised land, is the kingdom of God. The Jordan River was the boundary between this world and the next. Hence the line, on Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and I cast a wistful eye. You know, you think about this, what the person who wrote this song is trying to say. I'm standing at the brink of Jordan, Jordan being the transition from this life to that life, the end of this life. To stand on the banks of the Jordan River symbolically was just before you die. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and I cast a wistful eye. I wish for, I'm looking ahead, I want to be there, I'm excited about being there. It's where my possessions, my real possessions lie. My dad used to sing a song, when I come to the river at ending of day and the last winds of sorrow have blown. There'll be somebody waiting to show me the way. I won't have to cross Jordan alone. The crossing of the Jordan is a great symbol in the Bible and in song of passing from this world and its trials, its troubles, into the world to come. And as the old spiritual went, all my trials, Lord, soon be over. The wilderness wanderings were symbolic of this life with all of its troubles and trials in the Bible and in hymns. Camping and tabernacling were symbols of the temporary life we have now. We have the songs that found hope, not in this world, but in the land across the river. One of them, beautiful song, when they ring those golden bells for you and me, says, there's a land across the river that they call the sweet forever. And you only reach that land by faith's decree. Now, perhaps you can understand that when times are good, we invest a lot of ourselves in this world. We just do. We're concerned about where we're going to live. We're concerned about our house. We're concerned about our car, concerned about what we drive. We're concerned about our image. We're concerned about our clothes. When times are good, we invest a lot of ourselves, our time, our resources in this world. When times are hard and the days grow short, when we start to realize that all our hopes and all our dreams are going to end out there in the graveyard, that's when the music of our lives really begins to tell. And the message of pain is that you are mortal, that it's vain to place your hopes in the here and the now. It was Paul who said it. He said, if in this life only we have hope in Christ Jesus, we are of all men most miserable. And he said that looking way off into the future to the time when men will be raised from the dead. A lot of this was brought home to me a year ago with a new awareness of time when an old and sometimes friend of mine died. It's still hard for me to realize that this man who played such an influential role in my life is lying under 6 feet of East Texas dirt. It's just, I keep expecting to run into him at one of the local restaurants. Now, I know that man is not immortal. I know that we do not have an immortal soul, as the Greeks suggested that we do. Without the resurrection from the dead, we would be without hope. We all will lie in the grave and wait for the resurrection from the dead. I know that people in heaven are not looking down on us and watching us struggle through this life. Those people are all waiting in the grave, waiting for the last trumpet. Now, I made that statement because of what I'm about to tell you. That brings me back to the question of time. The very concept of time is an illusion. Science has demonstrated that what we call time is variable, that it can be a phenomenon called time dilation. That is to say, the rate at which we pass through time is variable. Theoretically, if we could accelerate our bodies to near the speed of light, time would appear to an onlooker to slow down, although to us it would seem to proceed at the same speed. And there's a scene in the movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when this ship has landed and has begun to disgorge the people they picked up years ago, the pilots that were lost in the Bermuda Triangle, are coming off the plane, and one of the fellows said, Einstein was right. They haven't aged a day since that time. The theory being that they had been out in the spaceship traveling at the speed of light or near the speed of light or something like that. And consequently, they had done all that they had done out there and come back to here in no time at all, at least it would seem. They didn't age. But all of us kept right on getting older. That's the theory. But when I think about this, I realize each of us lives in his own timeline. I've occasionally sat in a waiting room, doctor's office, airports, you got to amuse yourself somehow, and watch people. And I look at the people around me. They come and they go and they pass through my life momentarily. But when they are out of my sight, they might as well not exist. Have you ever played that little game with yourself? To imagine that when this person leaves the doctor's waiting room and turns left and goes down the hallway, to imagine yourself following that person and watching as he goes out, gets into his car, drives home, opens the front door, comes in, hugs his kid, gives his wife the news from the doctor, that this man has a complete, involved, detailed, complex life of which you know nothing. He follows a timeline of his own, you follow a timeline of your own, and they only cross that one time in the doctor's office, and for all intents and purposes, that other person only exists when he passes through your life. Then I thought about my old friend Ted. Ted lived in Ted time, and I live in Ron time. In Ted time, one moment he was lying on a gurney in a hospital room or a bed in a hospital room with medical people all around him trying to save his life in Ted time. In Ted time, in the next heartbeat, he was standing before his Maker on a sea of glass. Just like that. A snap of the fingers. One moment here, the next moment there. In Ron time, later I passed by his casket and I watched him loaded into a hearse and carried away out to be buried under that 6 feet of East Texas dirt. But you need to know this about Ted time as well. While he was standing there on the sea of glass before his Maker, I was there too. And so were you. In other words, what he did was pass through time instantaneously in Ted time to the time when we are all there with God. Does it seem strange to you? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it does. But there's a line in an old gospel song. It was a hit for Tennessee Ernie Ford, and I'll bet many of you could sit back there and tap your toe and sing it. Just a closer walk with thee. Remember this little line? When this feeble life is o'er, time for me shall be no more. That's incredible when you think about what he said in that song. When this feeble life is o'er, time for me will be no more. There's no longer a matter of passing mile markers that you can never retrace. There's no more of that. Time is no more. And so consequently, when Brother Ted was gone from me, he was present with his Maker as far as he was concerned. And I have a feeling there was a moment there when he wonders, he will in the future, for him it will be past. There will be a moment when he wondered, was I wrong about the time between death and the resurrection? But then he will understand what it was that had happened. I think this is a powerful idea, and it's reflection of something that the Apostle Paul said. You need to understand that many of these old gospel writers and spiritual songwriters were readers of the Bible. In fact, in the early days, that's really the only book many of them had to read. Many people read and learned to read by reading the Bible because there was nothing else to read. And so consequently, when the time came to write a song, guess what the source of it was? The Bible. Well, this particular passage of Scripture may have figured in that line from the Tennessee Ernie song. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Some people have found it troubling. I find it fascinating. The Apostle Paul says this, verse 1, 2 Corinthians 5. We know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved. Now what Paul has done is reach into the imagery of the Bible for the idea of a tent. And he's saying, I live in a tent, as it were. It's temporary. It's not going to be here forever. It's going to get old. And I had a tent once that we were sleeping in it one night out there in California, and I heard this little munch, 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 and it turned out field mice were eating a hole in my tent. And over the years, as it stored, it'd get a little mold here and there, and the tent poles would get broken, and I'd lose a tent pole, and then you could only camp next to a tree because you had to tie that corner of the tent. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? If our earthly house of this tent were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven. If so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened. And sometimes I hear one or the other of you groan when you get up out of a chair. Or hear a grunt when you bend over to tie your shoes. We groan in this tabernacle with the pains and the struggles that we have. It's just part of life is the pain. It's not that we want to be unclothed, it's that we want to be clothed upon. We don't want to just cease to exist. We want to be clothed differently. We want to be living in a house. Paul mixes his metaphors shamelessly, and so you have to be careful as you make your way through what he writes. He says we want to be clothed upon that mortality, that is this mortal flesh of ours that's decaying and rotting away and being dissolved, that it was swallowed up by life. Now he that has wrought for us the selfsame thing is God, who has given us the earnest of the Spirit. So we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. Clear as crystal. Here you sit in the body, and you're absent from God. Oh, he's present in spirit. We all understand that, but that's not what Paul's talking about, and we all know that. We walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. So we labor that whether we're present or absent, we may be accepted of him. Paul had come to the place in his life to where living in the flesh was becoming a burden. And he said, I really don't know what's best for me. I have a desire to depart and to be with Christ, but for me to stay here and work with you is far better. Now, when you read this, it sounds like, well, did he think he was going to be immediately with God? Oh, I don't think that Paul had any different point of view from Hebrews down through time about the immortality of the soul. But what Paul understood was that when this feeble life is o'er, time for him will be no more. And that in Paul time, he will go from this life to the face of God. That's what he wanted. And anyone who has been through tough times in your life and wanted to lie down and go to sleep, because in sleep you would feel no pain. People who sometimes have gone to bed praying that God would not let them wake up in the morning understand what that means. That sometimes life can be so difficult that you just wish God would let you let it go. That we know we can't do that, just as the Apostle Paul knew that he couldn't do it. In the past year, I've had a curious thing happen to me in a way, experience, in that for fleeting moments I feel a sense of excitement when I think about this. I'm 70 now. I fully hope and plan to go on to being 100, but whatever God wills, I will do. And I'm not in any hurry to leave this vale of tears. It's not bad enough for us here right now. But nevertheless, once you get to this stage of life, you do have to contemplate leaving it. And I was in the hospital recently for a change of medication, which you have to be there so they could watch you the whole time, so I was there. But I wandered up and down the hallways and looked in doorways and saw old people in the last moments of their life. And it was sobering because I thought to myself, one of these days I will be back in this place, and it'll be the last moments of mine. I don't know when it will be, but it's out there. It's coming just as sure as tomorrow's sunrise. And so, having thought about that, I had, as I mentioned, this little moment of excitement in the realization that one minute I would be there, and the next minute I would be in the presence of my God. I'm not as ready to go as Paul was, but I understand him better, and I realize that in my time, seeing Jesus is only a heartbeat away. Now, make no mistake about it. When you go to the grave, you will wait there until God has a desire to the work of his hands. But for all practical purposes, for you, and from your perspective, when your heartbeat stops, so does time. So does time. One moment, you may be looking at the face of a surgeon, and the next moment, at the face of God in your time. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven, if so that, being clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not that we want to be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. And for us, time will be no more.